of the migration. It was voluntary, but it was a very let's say asymmetric type of contract. I mean, many of the people were illiterate. They, it was the region was devastated by famine and poverty, the destruction of the agricultural complex and manufacture. People had no idea where Trinidad was. They called it Trinidad, and they did not know they had to cross. It would take 6 months to go halfway around the world, and the death rates on the ships were similar to like during slavery time and whatnot, and they inhabited the old slave barracks. It was it was a very unequal type of contract, but it was a contract. And it was voluntary. There were people. I mean, there are people who there was probably some trickery perhaps involved as well in it, but it was let's say uneven types of contracts, and there would be many people who were destitute, and many of the people were very young. If you look at the ages of the people, they were 16, 17, 18, 15, 21, very young people. They came from all castes, right? And many were in the agricultural caste, but they were shopkeepers and Brahmins and Kshatris, and the Brahmins that came continued their tradition. I mean, it's quite interesting in Trinidad that because my wife is from Mauritius, in fact, which is actually the island that received the most indentured laborers in the world, and it started there and then went to the West Indies after. Fiji is another place where it also about 1 million Indians were dispersed all over the plantation during that time. But they have a much closer distance to India and contact. So you will find a lot of pundits and people from India going to Mauritius and feeding the Hindu culture there. In Trinidad, the local Hindus have, by and large, done it themselves, and I suppose from memory, and the way the Brahmins make the children memorize things for centuries, and continued in the West Indies. Although there are sometimes some people that come from India, but it's not major. A lot of times, some pundits might go back to India for, but it's not a major thing. It is very indigenous, and in fact, I mean, a lot of the practices there are, I suspect, probably 19th century UP, Bihar religious practices that are preserved there in ways that may be lost in India itself. So it's quite interesting, even in terms of the name, like when a baby is born and they go and parents go to a pundit to have their child named and so forth. Very, very names typical of the deep country where most not common Indian names, Raj and Arjun and whatever you might see, very, very peculiar names of the UP countryside are very common in Trinidad. Lilawati and these types of these are names of relatives of mine. That would make people chuckle in India because they are country bumpkin names, right? That's what they are, the equivalent of. But so that was that. I was addressing the teaching part, the migration part. I think there was another part. I can't remember. What was the other? Oh, yes. I mentioned the Umpteen temple. The temples all over the place, and also there's a certain type of practice which people who are visiting from India when they come to Trinidad remark on. I think it's uniquely Trinidadian. I don't know if it's practiced in UP and beyond, but Hindu households have jhandis, these flags, outside of the home. Whenever they do a puja, which is a religious ceremony done at home, they have flags in different colors, represent different gods that we pray to, and that is the real mark of a Hindu area. And everybody has a little temple in their home and in their yard, and especially in the more Hindu areas of the country. And there's this an abundance of Hindu temples. This religiosity was just part of the being of the people who came across, and second nature. You have to do it. That's all. It's just you have to do it. That's all. You don't even think twice that it's something you have to do.
So I was just looking back on your political career with DNA a bit, and about around 10 years ago, you chose to not put up candidates for positions with the Karongi East and Shahuna East Alliance platform. And I was just wondering if you feel in the time since then that you've done more without putting people up for those positions than you could have by putting people up for those positions.
Well, okay, about the politics part. I do think that perhaps by deciding not to participate with the ruling party at the time, we saved ourselves from being stained. And so that, I mean, I know a lot of friends and colleagues of mine, my age, young people, who got involved in politics, and I think their careers have been ruined with the stains of corruption in a way that ours have not. So I think it was a good choice for us not to do that.
Firstly, thank you. That was a very informative session, and if I may address you as doctor. So we did go through certain situations where we had counterculture growing, the rise of counterculture sort of leading to misrepresentation of ancient Saraswati civilization. And you also did mention Deepak Chopra, Sadhguru Jaggi Vasudev, and a few other prominent speakers. But who would you feel is representing the Indian culture or the ancient Saraswati civilization in the right sense in the 21st century?
Yeah, that's interesting. I like Sri Vasudev. I think he has some very interesting ideas and approaches to things. I think David Frawley's writing is very, very fascinating. I myself, I don't know if I could give an answer for a particular person, but I like to listen widely and take a bit here, take a bit there, and well, I know with Panditji, we've been talking about doing something in Trinidad as well. I mean, he has a vision for establishing a community in Trinidad because what I think is so important is these ideas cannot exist just as ideas. They have to be part of a lived experience. Because, and when you live in a megalopolis, you can't practice certain way, getting up at the sun and doing your prayers and the sunset and in the morning, and these are and those things are so important in rooting you to the cosmos, to the sun and the moon and natural cycles. That is so important, and down to the design of the cities. Right? I mean, it's aligned with the cosmos, and if you believe those things, and I do, that it carries certain energies and it channels things. And if you are not in a in a urban design that channels that, you're missing a lot of that stuff. And so I think I'm very excited and interested in the project that Acharya wants to put there, because it has to be in a lived context. And when you are in, what's his name? Heidegger, right? German philosopher Heidegger talks about being there. That there's something that's extremely important about the existential situation about being there. It reveals certain things that you cannot get any other way except by being there at the time. Um, when you are in a certain context, your mind opens up, you experience, you think of certain things, things enter into your head that would not enter otherwise, you know, and so those things I think are very important, and it can never be just the ideas that you read in a book or you've heard someone speak somewhere, you know, and that's one of the reasons why I say, you know, that culture is lost to us, because the context is lost. And it's only if you bring back the context, which includes the natural and built environment as well. If you smell the particular flowers, and all those things are important. All those things are important. Thank you.
Why did the Indian people migrate to West Indies, Trinidad or something? Was that a colony of British rule also?
Oh yes. Trinidad was a British colony. Slavery had ended. The planters in the West Indies did not want to deal with free African labor. They preferred to deal with bonded labor. They were used to slaves, and slavery was illegal, so this was the next best thing to slavery. It happened 5 years, and then the East India Company, you know, had a pool of degraded persons in the Gangetic Plain where ancestors came from, and you know, and there were famines and that were caused by company rule up there, and so the British had that there, and the planters in the East India Company and the West India Company and the East India Company came up with the scheme. They actually tried Chinese labor at a certain point. They had Portuguese as well. That didn't work out, but the Indian laborers proved to be very good for the sugar industry and planters. So that's how it came. It was an organized migration by the East India Company and the West India planters.
So then they were forced to go to Trinidad.
That's why I said it's hard, because it's not like they came and captured them or something. People signed contract. They were illiterate. It was a thumbprint most of the time. They couldn't read what was in the contract, but it was a contract. You know, so I don't know what you want to call that. You understand? It's formally it's legal, but you know it's not really informed consent, right? And so
before the British rule, nobody migrated to Trinidad.
No, they had no idea where. They had no idea where.
So after the British rule, I think, you know, like people were not famine or this thing, but they were not happy with the rule of British.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they didn't, you know, like what do you call, voluntarily go to Trinidad.
No, it was an organized migration where there were recruiters. The name for them was Arkatia, who went out into the villages and told people, and you know, you could go to Trinidad, Chini meaning sugar, and you know, you'd get so much money and this and that, and you know, fooled people into doing it, and that was part of the thing. But you know, very interestingly, the Indian nationalist movement, one of their first big struggles was to end indenture. I mean, Gandhi, that's when he went to South Africa, and he saw, because a lot of indentured laborers went to South Africa as well, and that was a struggle, and that struggle to end indentured labor, which is 100 years ago this year, was arguably the beginning of the nationalist movement, and all the Satyagraha not the Swaraj, that was later, but the Satyagraha movement in South Africa that Gandhi started was actually about indentured labor, because when he went there, the scheme was still around.
Why did you call this ancient Saraswati civilization? I don't think it's a name for the ancient civilization, right?
Well, it can't be because it's English, right? But certainly it's from a discussion with Acharya Ram Samuja. I mean, you could call it Indus Valley civilization, you could call it Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, but I think my understanding from what Acharya Ram Samuja is trying to get at it. First of all, it's wider than the Indus Valley, what we see, because a lot of it is actually submerged underwater, because the land boundaries were different, and I think it conjures something more than just the geographical terrain. It's speaking to something more than just the physical. It's also the metaphysical.
I think it changes the what do you call, the root of the discussion here.
Mm-hmm.
When you say Saraswati, ancient Saraswati, it goes to education.
Yes, exactly. That is obviously a part of it, yeah, because Saraswati is a goddess of education and learning and music and so forth. Cool.
There has been a great river called Saraswati.
Of course, yes.
And it is the civilization that grew up around that river that is known as the Saraswati civilization. And some can argue it has been the origin of man's civilization in the world. And one of the arguments they have put up is that you had three major rivers: the Sindhu River, which now is known as the Indus River, and you have the Ganga River, which is now known as the Ganges. But the Saraswati River formed somewhat like a triangle, and you had three major rivers enclosing the Ganges plain, where there was an immense amount of fresh water, and fresh water gave rise to plants.
I will take the final question, and we're running out of time, but we have just a couple of minutes, so I'll take the privilege of making the last question, because it hasn't come up yet, and I'd like to know, we think of Trinidad as a little India,